will kind of pick up where Georg before me left off, and that's the notion of understanding differences between university systems in different countries and between universities as organizations. And the title addresses the notion of convergence and divergence, and I will base my presentation on two research projects that we're involved in at the moment. One in flagship universities in 8 small countries around Germany, the horseshoe shape around Germany, the 4 Nordics, the Low Countries, and Switzerland, Austria, as well as a project funded by a German foundation, which is looking into the place of the university in society, where we are especially interested in the way in which universities themselves see their relationship with society, changes in there, and also how they've adapted their organization, and what kind of barriers they see to realize these kinds of visions they have about how they want to position themselves in society. Starting point is like with the book by Burton Clark, The Higher Education System, also because this book is kind of it exemplifies a change between knowledge and understanding of university organization and the way that universities operate on the basis of narratives and books of successful or not very successful university leaders towards scholarship. Also, the cover text of this book, written by John Mayer, expresses it very clearly. This is a work that was much needed, which is a work of scholarship, which has theory, and which tries to contribute to the field of comparative research on higher education, and it will be an important book. And he was right, that had been translated in Chinese, in Spanish, and Russian, and especially in Europe, it has played a very, very important role in the development of scholarship on higher education. And Clark identifies 3 basic elements in the organization of higher education systems: work, belief, or culture, and authority. And he identifies elements that can be used to get a better understanding of changes or differences in the organization of higher education and in national higher education systems. I started to work at the Center for Higher Education Policy Studies in the Netherlands in 1985, and we were also very interested in this question. How can we understand university organization in the Netherlands with university organization in other countries? We used the word Clark a lot, but of course, as Lars also was into already, the world has changed, and if you want to understand the university organization and differences between countries, you have to move beyond Durkheim, Archer, and others that Clark was basing his work on. So our question at CHEPS at that time was, how do university reforms contribute to changes in universities? What exactly is the impact of reforms, amongst other things, on university organization? And in analyzing university reform agendas, these elements, the underlying assumptions, can be highlighted that gradually became more visible about the importance of autonomy, the importance of strategic actorhood, the role of university leadership, and the intention to move from loosely coupled systems to universities as more tightly coupled systems. And if we want to understand the impacts of university reform since the 1980s on university organization, then in the 1990s a very important dominant perspective in the academic literature, especially with respect to continental Europe. And with continental Europe, I first and foremost refer to these 8 countries, to Germany, to France. There was a basic understanding of the impact of reforms, and that was that these reforms would lead to convergence. Gradually, all higher education systems would become more and more similar in their academic organization, both nationally and institutionally. And also in our work at CHEPS, the University of Twente, we emphasize this convergence assumption and focus especially on the agendas kind of acknowledge this point. But if we look at the 2010s, the last 10 years, then more and more, also on the basis of our empirical work, the question comes up, is there a convergent trend? If we look at key elements of university organization or in the way we look at universities more as organized systems, using the work of Jim March, with Hayes, with Cohen, and especially with Johan Olsen. And one perspective, one way to answer this question is that there is a kind of a trend that all universities around the world are following the US example. And this is from an American scholar recently published in an element of one of his articles, saying that there's a corporate governance structure of US universities, competitive market, etc., and that universities around the world copy it, even though they copy it often poorly. But we would argue that this is a kind of perspective that cannot be supported with empirical material. If we look at reform agendas where there is this converging trend, then you can say that these are based on belief systems. They are based on a set, they consist of a set of commitments. Key assumptions are problematic. They are unverified by theoretically oriented empirical research. And what we concluded in a book that I edited with Johan Olsen in 2007, an article Tom Christensen, Åse Gunitska, and I wrote some years ago, is that you can identify converging reform agendas that have been referred to in the literature, right, like rule-like status of certain global scripts. But there's a diverging reform instrumentation and diverging reform outcomes. And the reform instrumentation has to do with a low reproductive reliability of ideas underlying these global reform agendas when it comes to the instrumentation of national reforms, as well as when it comes to implementing these reforms. There are all kinds of counter-scripts, if you can call them like that, acting as filters both nationally, regionally, as well as at the institutional level, having a strong impact on the way that reforms are implemented. If you look at the practice at the Nordic countries compared to 15 years, 20 years ago, there is a continuing, in some cases even, a growing divergence when it comes to the legal status of universities, when it comes to the governance structures, when it comes to the organization of the primary processes, the university funding model. And if we try to understand it, also going back to the question that Georg raised at the end, from a comparative perspective, how can we understand differences between countries, and especially when we look at the impact of reforms, then what we have developed based on the four visions that were included in this 2007 book developed by Johan Olsen, is that the dominant underlying ideas under these reforms are contradicting, not always in balance, with the underlying ideas, the dominant ideas within the higher education, within the university system, as well as within the public governance system. So the reforms represent one set of ideas, but the way in which the university relationship with society and the university's relationship with state authorities has been developed throughout history is, as said, based on different ideas. So the four kind of sets of ideas that we identified are a university as a norm-steered academic community, as an instrument for national authorities, as a representative democracy, and as a service company in a market. And this is an example of applying the model when it comes to understanding how decisions are made within a university, how a formal governance structure is supposed to function, where emphasizing or seeing the university as a norm-steered academic community emphasizing minimal governance when it comes to the role of actors and bodies in governance structures, an elected moderator, that's the role of the leader, authority through academic competence, the role of the state as a patron. If you compare that to the other models, then you can see the differences. And also, if we take a step back and analyze the development around the world, the move away from one global idea underlying the university that maybe before the Second World War still existed, there's a growing emphasis on one or two of these models within national university systems. To simplify it, you could say that the instrument for national university as an instrument for national authorities, that is a set of ideas that relates to Chinese higher education. The way that university organization, governance, funding is developed and materialized in China relates to notions about what role is the university playing in the realization of the national development agenda. The same could be said when it comes to one dominant idea of US, UK higher education service company in a market where certainly in the UK, when it comes to the role of governance, actors and bodies, there's an emphasis on assuring an economically oriented management approach with the leader as a CEO in the organization. If we look at the practice of higher education, you can see very clearly what this means when you look at developments in the governance structure, the leadership structure of universities in Europe, where at the moment there's a combination of these four visions, but with a special emphasis on the university as a community and the university as a democracy, with less dominant roles for the market and the national agenda approach. Here are two leaders of two universities, one in Norway and one in Britain. And the British one is the leader, or was the leader, of Bath University. Here are some characteristics of Bath University: 17,000 students, quite a number of international, not ranked in Shanghai, a few ERC projects, a budget of $340 million, and the vice chancellor's salary is $610,000. And the University of Oslo, the other one, larger than Bath, a larger budget, more prominently ranked, but the rector's salary is about $180,000. Now, you can ask what's the importance of the rector's salary. It's not about the rector's salary per se, but if you go back to these models that I just presented, the vice chancellor of Bath is supposed to have this economically oriented management style, which is assumed to be very important for the success of the university. And the success of the university is first and foremost measured through its economic success, not its academic success, and the way in which students are satisfied in the graduate programs, which is assumed to lead to a greater attractiveness of the graduate programs, high tuition fee paying students, etc. While in Oslo, the university is embedded in a different kind of sets of ideas, emphasizing democracy, emphasizing university as a community of scholars with elements of market and linked to the national authorities there. But success is not as dominant as in Bath, not as dominated by economic criteria, and the university rector is much more a primus inter pares, even though the tasks of the rector have increased quite dramatically over the last few years. What kind of conclusion can we, for the moment, come to when it comes to the empirical data from our projects? There is a trend towards a more integrated university organization in continental Europe, absolutely. But there's a significant variation among countries, and variations with respect to university as an organized system haven't become less in the last 10, 15 years. They have become, in many respects, larger. There are counter-scripts, if you can call them that, in all countries, moderating the executive nature of the intended outcomes of university reforms. And in one of our articles, we concluded that there's a university governance paradox in line with what Georg also was indicating. The more university leadership tries to realize the aims of the university reforms, the less the university contributes to the realization of these reforms. And the last point is that in the discussions around the idea underlying the university, so what kind of university for what kind of society do we want in Europe, there is a growing intention, a growing understanding that there is a need for a third way, in simple terms, between the Anglo-Saxon and the Chinese way of organizing a university. And certainly now with Brexit and the growing marginalization of Britain in science in Europe, the focus is on Germany. That's why also Georg's presentation was important. There is a growing political focus on Germany, with the expectation that Germany is leading other European countries in this quest for a specific university governance and organization approach, which would be able to show where Europe wants to stand in the global trends, and the university is supposed to play a very important role in this. Thank you very much for your attention.